הוא מחובר?
בבקשה, אני מוכן לחכות.
חברים, יש לנו תרגום, יש לנו תרגום, אפשר לשים. גיל, בסדר? אתה מסתדר?
Speak, but no מספיק.
Hello, Professor Dershowitz. Thank you for joining us. We'd like to hear your opinion about the first draft law that we are discussing, the Prime Minister incapacity. Please.
Alan, with your permission,
It's אלעזר שטרן.
the chairman here allowed me to ask you...
בסוף, לא, אלעזר. אלעזר.
אני כבר...
לא,
אוקיי.
Sorry,
so I will leave my question later on.
Okay.
תודה.
Well, thank you very much for allowing me the great honor of addressing this distinguished committee of the Knesset. I have been a long lifetime supporter of Israel. I go around the world to universities and try my best to defend Israel, not only in courts of public opinion, but also in courts of law. I have been a close student of the Israeli judiciary. As many of you know, I have been a close friend of the former president of the Supreme Court, Aaron Barak. We met at Harvard in 1966. I've also been a close friend of the Prime Minister of Israel, who I met in the early 1970s, also at Harvard and MIT. I have been deeply involved in and concerned about the judicial reforms that have been proposed. As some of you probably know, I am a critic of some of these reforms. I personally believe that the Supreme Court should have the last and final word on issues of minority rights, basic civil liberties, basic human rights. I also think that the process by which the justices are appointed should not be political. It should be professional and based on the highest criteria for service in the judiciary. But on the issue that's before this committee today, the issue of what role, if any, the Supreme Court and other courts should play in removal of the duly elected Prime Minister of Israel, I am completely in support of this legislation. I do not believe that courts, even the Supreme Court, should have any role to play whatsoever in deciding whether a duly elected Prime Minister is not competent to serve, whether the duly elected Prime Minister has an inability to serve based on medical or other reasons. Those issues should be entirely in the hands of the Knesset and the government. And I think that the law that has been proposed, which is essentially based on the 25th Amendment of the United States Constitution, gets it right. It basically says that the decision about whether a prime minister is competent, is able to continue to serve, is a decision that, first of all, should be made by the prime minister. The same thing is true in the United States under the 25th Amendment. The president gets to make the decision. And then the government gets to second guess if the prime minister or the president is not competent to make the decision, if the prime minister is in a coma, unconscious, or disabled, then, of course, the decision has to be made by a different body, and that body should be the duly elected government, the government. And then, if there's questions about that, the Knesset itself, by a supermajority vote, can make the decision. But I feel very, very strongly, having studied the legal systems in countries all over the world and having taught and practiced constitutional law in the United States for nearly 60 years, that courts, unelected courts, should not play a role in deciding whether the prime minister is able to serve. That is essentially a legislative decision. That is essentially a decision that should be based on the will of the people, not the will of the elite judges. As I've said before, I think that elite judges, non-democratically appointed judges, have an important role to play as a check on popular power. And I think that unelected judges, elite judges appointed because of their competence and because of their ability, should be deciding minority rights, such as the right of free speech, the right of due process, the right of religious freedom, the right to have a fair trial. All of those should be decided by the Supreme Court. But the role of the court should be limited to those basic core human rights, civil liberties, and minority issues. The role of the court should not be extended to making essentially political decisions about whether or not an elected prime minister can be essentially impeached or unelected. This is particularly so in a parliamentary system, where, as you know better than I do, by a simple vote of 61 to 59, a duly elected prime minister can be removed from office based on a simple vote of non-confidence. So what we're talking about is situations where that vote has not taken place, where the prime minister continues to serve under the control of the Knesset, but where it is argued that perhaps because of medical or other reasons, he is incompetent to serve. And it's important to have a system like that. We've had situations in the United States, for example, when a president has had Alzheimer's, or when a high-ranking official has had other illnesses. Every country has situations where the leader, the president or the prime minister, has to undergo surgery, has to be anesthetized, has to be unconscious. There has to be a process for replacing the prime minister, either in the short term or the long term. And this proposed law does a very good job in laying out the factors and the criteria that should be used to temporarily or even permanently remove a prime minister. It's crucially important that the role of courts in a democracy be carefully defined. Courts have a very important role to play, particularly in a country without a constitution, particularly in a country which has a single legislature, not a bicameral legislature, particularly in a country which has coalition governments of this kind. It's crucially important that there be a check and balance on the power of the majority. But that check should not extend to decisions regarding the incompetence of the prime minister, the medical illness of a prime minister, the impeachment or removal of a prime minister. Those are decisions that are quintessentially political, legislative, popular, part of democracy, not inconsistent with democracy. Democracy is majority power. A good democracy includes checks on majority power and includes minority rights, rights of free speech, rights of due process. And so my message to you today, humbly and respectfully, because I'm not an Israeli, but because I love Israel and love so many people on both sides of this issue. My message is, yes, the court should have an important role to play on core basic minority rights, human rights, but not in political decision-making, not in the service of the prime minister, and not in how to disqualify a duly elected prime minister. And so I'm happy to take any questions from you, and I want to emphasize that my goal from the beginning has been to try to encourage compromise. I think that Israel is being torn apart by people on both sides that seem not to be willing to compromise. And I have offered compromises. And one of the compromises I have offered is to maintain the role of the Supreme Court as a check on majority power and allowing the Supreme Court to play an important role in protecting minority rights and civil liberties, but not to interfere in the political process and not to make decisions that go beyond the traditional role of courts all over the world, that is, to enforce the law, but not to intrude into the political processes of democracy. Thank you so much for the opportunity to express my views, and I hope and pray that these issues can be resolved peacefully and cooperatively and in a compromised fashion. Thank you so much. Toda rabah.
Thank you very much. We will close the discussion about the subject, and שנייה. אני עכשיו צריך לעבור, הוא נשאר איתנו לחוק הבא, אז אני אאפשר לו, ואז אנחנו בעצם נעבור לחוק בסדר, אז שנייה, אני רק אאפשר לו על החוק השני, ואז תוכל לדבר. Sorry. So we will close the discussion about this subject, and we will reopen the committee to start the next law with your opinion. אז אנחנו בעצם עכשיו סוגרים את הדיון על נבצרות ועוברים לחוק
לא, אבל אני רוצה לשאול אותו על
לא,
זה.
ניתן לו לדבר, כי הוא... אין בעיה,
על החוק על זה.
על זה או על זה, אין בעיה.
אנחנו נשאל אותו שאלות ספציפית על הדיון הזה, ואז יתחיל הדיון הבא.
אוקיי,
בסדר?
זה מה שביקשתי.
כן, אתה תיתן את זה ביחד, כי פשוט מוגבל מאוד בזמן.
אוקיי, אפשר לשאול אותו?
לא, שנייה, עכשיו אנחנו עוברים לחוק של המינוי שרים. לא, נעשה את זה ביחד, תשאלו על איזה נושא שאתם רוצים.
זה ממש שתיים.
לא, אני לא רוצה להחזיק אותו יותר מדי, הוא מאוד לחוץ בזמן.
שאלה קצרה.
הוא נמצא, אבל אני רוצה שהוא יתחיל לדבר על החוק השני, ואז תשאלו אותו שאלות, אין בעיה.
אבל למה לא על החוק הזה?
גם על החוק הבא, גם על החוק הזה, אלעזר, אני לא מגביל. So we would like to hear your opinion about this law. Now, thank you.
Well, my views on the second law, the law regarding the decision by the Prime Minister with the approval of the Knesset to appoint ministers is essentially the same as on the Prime Minister's law. I do not believe that the Supreme Court should have the power to tell the Prime Minister or the Knesset who can serve in the government, who can serve in the cabinet, who can serve in various positions. In the United States Constitution, specifically it says that Congress decides who has the qualifications to serve in any congressional offices. And the courts play no role whatsoever in deciding who shall be allowed to serve. And I believe the same thing is true with regard to members of the government. It's very important that the Prime Minister be allowed to pick people that she or he approve of and feel comfortable with and can work with. And I want to make it clear, I'm not talking about any particular individuals, far be it from me as an American to interfere with political decisions and decisions about who should be appointed to various governmental roles and cabinet and ministerial positions. I take the position neutrally and as a matter of principle that this is not a decision that the courts should be able to exercise discretion about, even if all the justices of the Supreme Court feel strongly that a particular person should not be able to be in the government because of history, because of convictions of crime, because of anything else. That's a decision that has to be made by the Knesset. Knesset has the power to pass laws, setting out qualifications, but once those qualifications set out by the Knesset are met, the court should not be able to overrule those decisions and exercise its discretion. I am not a supporter of the Supreme Court's role in defining reasonableness or unreasonableness when it comes to political decisions of this kind. This has nothing to do with human rights. It has nothing to do with civil liberties. It has nothing to do with minority rights. These are purely political decisions which essentially get made largely on partisan grounds. And so although I would preserve the role of the Supreme Court, and here I disagree with many of my friends, I would preserve the role of the Supreme Court in making decisions about minority rights and human rights, but I would not extend the role of the Supreme Court to second-guessing decisions made by the government and made by the Knesset. So I completely support the law that takes the Supreme Court out of the decision-making process as to who should be able to serve in positions of honor and authority in the government, ministerial, and other such positions. So I think the two laws are very similar in principle. They both deny courts who are not elected, who are elitist and should be elitist. That's the role of courts, to serve as a non-democratic check on the power of the majority. That's the appropriate role of an elite Supreme Court. But it is not an appropriate role of an unelected Supreme Court to second-guess elected officials as to who should be able to serve in the government in positions of ministerial responsibility. So I support this law as well as the other law, while maintaining my opposition to the judicial reforms that would deny the Supreme Court its appropriate power over issues of minority and other such rights. And I would also preserve my objection to the manner by which Supreme Court justices are appointed. I do not approve of a process by which justices are appointed by a majority of people who are involved in politics. I think the majority process should involve a non-political, non-partisan appointing process. But that's an issue for a different day. My main point here today is that the courts, however appointed and however selected, should have no role to play in deciding whether a prime minister is fit for office or whether a cabinet member or a minister is able to serve his or her government. So thank you again very much for the honor of giving you my opinion on these very important matters.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Elazar?
Hi, Professor Darshowitz. First of all, as always, happy to meet you, happy to hear you. I think it's very important for all of us. May I ask you before, and I can guess even before, that your opinion about this both law will be the same, because you really made sense between the same logic which behind these two laws. But I only I'm wondering if you already have been invited to the other committee of the Law and Justice, where is the all reforms dealing there?
No, I have not. And I would be honored to play any role in trying to bring about a resolution, in trying to move the debate away from extremes. I'm right completely, you're wrong completely, I'm wrong completely, you're right completely, away from extremes and toward a principled compromise where the roles of the court are set out very clearly and in a limited way. So I would be happy to appear before any committee or any body of the Knesset or any institution in Israel to set out my views, and if I can be in any way helpful in producing a compromise, it would be my greatest honor and pleasure.
Okay, first of all, I really appreciate it. I will contact you later to ask about your compromise, which you really can offer us. And unfortunately, I don't want you to be invited only when you can support the head of one committee, or not to be invited to the other committee. I promise you, I will call you later, and thank you for everything that you said here.
Last question, אפרת, בבקשה.
Hello, dear sir. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Efrat Reiten from the Labour Party, and I've heard and listened to your wise and important words and answer before, but I wanted to say two things. First of all, do you think that in anyhow and any way you can let the Prime Minister or the ministers be in the role? I mean, there are no balances or no lines, red lines. When you read this law, this bill that in front of us, it says nothing about borders, nothing about, situations that might be or maybe taking us to a corruptions. That's first of all, and the second thing is, it is very not similar, the legal system and the judicial system and the democratic system between our two states. So comparing things that happen or being held in the United States and in Israel are sometimes are not right, because, for example, you have the direct election and we do not. We have only our one parliament. We don't have, the right. We don't have the Bill of Rights and etc. So we don't have balances and checks and balances. So I think when we don't have the impeachment process here in Israel, and because we don't have checks and balances, and because of the unique situation that we are now being with, because our Prime Minister is, being on trial, so we have to take everything into consideration when we are dealing very carefully with these kind of bills in front of us and legislation, and we cannot untack, everything from everything right now.
I agree. The question is not what is decided. The question is who decides. The question is what institutions of government make these important decisions. Every institution of government is capable of corruption. And historically, every institution of every government, everywhere in the world, has been subject to the possibility of corruption. Israel is different than the United States, but it's not unique in the world. Most democracies are parliamentary democracies, and I'm not aware of parliamentary democracies in which the courts play so critical a role as they do under current law in deciding whether or not a minister can serve or whether or not possibly a prime minister can serve. There are differences between the United States. We do not have direct elections. We have what's called the Electoral College, which is an indirect election, and 2 times in recent years, minority candidates, including President Trump and President Bush, were made president of the United States against the majority wishes. And we've had great difficulty in deciding what the criteria are for impeachment. As you probably know, I stood in front of the United States Senate and defended President Trump, who I voted against twice, defended him on constitutional grounds, on the ground that Congress had gone too far, and impeached him on grounds that were not specified in the Constitution. So these are very difficult and complex issues. The real question is not whether there should be checks and balances. Yes, there should be. The real question is whether or not a Supreme Court appointed by the mechanism that Israel has, or some variation of that mechanism, but not popularly elected, should be the institution that checks on the popular branches of the government, and if so, by what criteria. And my strong opinion is that the decision should not be made based on personnel, based on do you like or don't you like this particular minister, do you like or don't you like this particular prime minister, but on enduring principles. And the principle that's very important is that the decision whether a prime minister can serve or whether a cabinet member, a minister can serve, is a decision that is essentially political. And the checks and balances should come from within the Knesset and within the government, and not be something that includes the role of the judiciary. The judiciary plays a very important role. And we know from experience, when the role of the judiciary is expanded so much, its power and its acceptability gets diluted. And so when you give the courts too much power, the power to decide who serves in the government, the power to decide whether a prime minister can continue to serve, when you give them that kind of power, that dilutes the important power that they should have on whether or not minority rights are preserved, due process, equal protection. Those are the core issues that courts should engage in checks and balances. Courts should not engage in checking and balancing the voters and the democratic process of who is elected, who stays in office. That, it seems to me, is not an appropriate role for the Supreme Court. And I think the recent events demonstrate that the public generally approves of the Supreme Court, but approves of its role, its core role in defending rights and defending minority rights, not in intruding into the political process. So those are my strong feelings based on not the unique American perspective, but looking at countries all over the world, looking at countries in Europe, and looking at the role of courts. Remember that in most countries, there is no judicial review. We didn't have judicial review in the United States until 1803, Marbury versus Madison. And in judicial review in the United States is very limited. We have a concept called standing. We have case and controversy. No American court would ever interfere in the impeachment process or in the process of deciding who can serve in a cabinet position. Again, yes, America is different. Yet, yes, England and Canada are different. But we, I think all of us, can learn from comparative institutions. And I think if you look at the world comparatively, you see that courts should not be playing a role of deciding who is a minister or whether a prime minister can continue to serve.
אוקיי, thank you. לא, זהו, אלעזר, הוא צריך ללכת, סליחה. לא, בסדר, הוא צריך ללכת. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Dershowitz. Thank you very much.
It's my honor.
Thank you.